Time travel has been a staple of science fiction for over 100 years, but it's only recently that scientists have been seriously looking at whether traveling into the past or the far future might be possible. Some scientists believe that they've cracked how to do just that, while other non-scientists have also claimed to have invented a time machine, or even accidentally time traveled. Time travel is still a mysterious concept, but these stories may make some believe. Number 5. The Vatican Secret Archives is home to some of the best-kept secrets in the world, if the rumors are to be believed. One of those secrets may be the secret of time travel. In the early 1960s, a priest named Father Ernetti told a friend, Father Brune, about a device he and a group of scientists had created. It allowed them to look back in time and watch historical moments, such as the Last Supper and the speech of Marcus Cicero. The device was called the chronovisor. Looking back in time is far from science fiction. It's something we all do from time to time. Looking into the night sky, we see stars as they are hundreds or even thousands of years ago. That's due to how far they are from the Earth and how fast light travels. The closest star to Earth, other than our Sun, is Proxima Centauri. The star is 4.25 light years away, which means we see it as it was 4.25 years ago. Even for objects as close as our Sun, there's an 8-minute delay between light leaving the Sun and reaching us on Earth. But seeing Earth as it was decades or even centuries ago, without traveling hundreds of light years away, isn't something we know how to do. Father Ernetti was a well-respected priest who specialized in studies in archaic music. He was described as a quiet intellectual and wrote multiple books on the subject. It was while trying to work with the recording of some Gregorian chants that the idea of listening back to unintentional recordings of the past came to mind. He and another priest were at the Catholic University of Milan, working on a recording of some old Gregorian chants again. Suddenly, they heard the voice of the second priest's father coming from the speaker. The man hadn't been heard on the recording before, and there was no explanation for how the voice could have appeared. Ernetti began to ponder what other things might have been accidentally recorded throughout history, and if there was any way to listen back to those recordings. According to Ernetti, he'd worked with a team of 12 scientists on this project. Those included Enrico Fermi and Werner von Braun. The others wished to remain anonymous. Fermi and Braun had both passed away by the time their names were attached to the chronovisor. They created a device that used a number of cathode ray tubes and antennae made from mysterious materials. They were able to detect light and sound from the entirety of their respective wavelengths. The rest of the machine then converts that into a display that could be watched like a TV. It wasn't a time machine in a sense that it allowed people to travel back in time, but simply allowed them to look back at the past. Father Ernetti first brought this up with Father Brune when they were discussing different interpretations of the Bible. He explained that there was a way to determine exactly what had happened. He claimed to have witnessed the events of the Last Supper, the betrayal of Judas, and Jesus' final moments on the cross. Brune completely believed Ernetti, though others have been harder to convince. The priest kept the device a secret for several years before an interview with an Italian publication in 1972. In the article, he explained what he had to Father Brune, and even produced a photo of Jesus on the cross, which he claimed had been taken through the chronovisor, but that was quickly debunked. It was actually a photo of a statue that appeared on postcards from Italy. Another piece of evidence he produced was part of the play Thyestes. Thyestes was the last play by poet Quintus Ennius, who lived between 239 and 169 BC. Many of his works have since been lost, including Thyestes. Ernetti claimed to have tuned in to watch a performance of the play and transcribed part of it. He wrote it in what he claimed was the original Latin, but there have been some doubts cast on this too. Some words used wouldn't have been a part of the language until centuries after the play was produced, and some experts have said that it doesn't seem to have been written by someone fluent in the language. Despite the skepticism from elsewhere, the Vatican seemed to be taking the threat seriously. In 1988, a decree was passed that stated anyone using an instrument of such characteristics would be excommunicated. Ernetti never stopped insisting that the chronovisor was real, but didn't talk about it as much in his later years. Friends often believed that he had been ordered by the church not to. He claimed that the machine had been safeguarded by the church, and many believe it's being kept in the Vatican's secret archives. Ernetti never revealed exactly how it worked. If something like this got into the wrong hands, there would be no way for anyone to maintain privacy. Even shortly before he passed away in 1994, Ernetti wrote letters maintaining that the machine was real. However, shortly after he passed away, the editors of a book on the subject received a letter from someone claiming to be a relative of Ernetti. The relative wished to remain anonymous, but claimed that Ernetti confessed to faking the photo of Jesus and the play. He did, however, insist that the machine was real. Like the chronovisor itself, this confession has never been verified. If the chronovisor is real and locked away in the Vatican, it's possible that nobody will ever see it again. The Vatican secret archives supposedly contain the answers to countless mysteries, as well as secrets that the church wouldn't want to get out, and those secrets are well guarded. Number 4. For Dr. Robert Mallett, time travel started as a desperate hope of seeing his father again. It led to him becoming one of the first African Americans to earn a PhD in physics. But that interest in what sounds like science fiction never faded. Ronald was 11 years old when he first read H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. It's one of the oldest novels to discuss time travel, and the first that actually has a device that transports the protagonist to the future. A young Ronald tried to cobble together his own time machine from his bike and spare electrical parts to travel back in time a year and save his father. It didn't work, but he didn't stop dreaming. Ronald was the oldest child of Dorothy and Boyd Mallett. Boyd was a World War II veteran who had used the GI Bill to go to university. He became a television repairman, and the family moved to the Bronx in New York. Ronald adored his father, and Boyd would buy the children educational toys and teach Ronald about electronics. When Ronald was 10 years old, his father passed away due to a heart attack. His son was devastated. The loss made that much worse when the family had to move back to Pennsylvania and was left struggling with poverty. Ronald became isolated, skipped school, and submerged himself in books. The Time Machine was just one of those books, but it was the one that gave him a light to move towards. About a year after reading The Time Machine, Ronald came across a book called The Universe and Dr. Einstein in a Goodwill store. It featured a photo of Einstein and an hourglass. Ronald had already heard of Einstein at this point and figured that this book would tell him about the great scientist's thoughts on the concept of time. Einstein was the first scientist to connect space and time. They were the same thing, and things that affected space affected time. His theory of general relativity stated that the stronger a gravitational pull, the more something affects time. This was later proven to be true. Clocks on Earth would move slower than clocks on satellites orbiting the planet. After reading the book, Ronald realized that creating a time machine could be possible. It wasn't just a science fiction story. It was a real turning point in his life. He stopped playing truant and started studying hard. He got top marks and wanted to go to university to study physics, but he couldn't afford it. Like his father, he took advantage of the GI Bill to help with his tuition fees. He enlisted in the Air Force and served during the Vietnam War. Even then, he spent his free time studying before enrolling at Penn State. Ronald described it as a lonely time. He didn't socialize much as he dedicated so much time to studying and understanding the theories of space and time and gravity. But he also felt that he couldn't talk to his fellow classmates or professors about his dreams of making time travel a reality. In the 1980s, time travel was still seen as nothing more than science fiction, and any scientist who wanted to look into it wouldn't be taken seriously. Ronald also knew that as an African American and one of a few in his field, he was even less likely to be taken seriously. But Ronald continued to work on his theories while studying in the closest acceptable area to time travel: black holes. Black holes had been predicted decades earlier, but it wasn't until 1971 that one was even discovered. They remain mysterious to this day, and when Ronald was getting his PhD, there was even more to discover about them. Today, they remain at the center of many time travel theories. That's in part because there's so much we don't know about them, such as what happens to the matter that's consumed, but also due to the same theory of general relativity that gave Ronald hope in time travel. Black holes have a huge amount of gravity and actually curve space-time. Ronald's first theory for time travel involved using spinning black holes. These black holes have two event horizons. Between them, space-time is warped, which could allow someone to travel between times. Of course, not only would getting close enough to a black hole to test this theory be extremely dangerous, but there aren't any spinning black holes nearby for us to try. While recovering from surgery in the mid-1990s, Ronald came across a theory that was more realistic. Accepted scientific theories state that light can create gravity. It's also been established that gravity can affect time, so light can affect time. Ronald's time machine would be a cylinder, with laser lights rotating around the outside. His theory states that space-time within a cylinder would be warped. With enough energy, it could form a complete loop. Ronald has built a prototype and is working with experts in the field of lasers to get it just right. At the moment, he's focusing on twisting empty space within his machine. A neutron would then be placed in the warped space to see if it moves. Time would be the next step. There are a few problems with Ronald's proposed time machine. The first is just how much energy would be needed to power it. Some scientists have claimed that it would need to be larger than the known universe, which would be very impractical. It would also be incredibly expensive, and it's unlikely that money would come from the public sector. Ronald sees real potential for his time machine to help humanity. It could be used to send back information about natural disasters to a time before they could occur. But even with that, it would be unrealistic for any government to take on the project. It would have to be a private individual or individuals funding this research, and none have taken any interest so far. The other issue is that the time machine would only be able to transport information back into time to the point where the machine was turned on. Many critics of time travel have asked why, if time machines exist in the future, nobody has traveled back to the present with one. At least with Ronald's time machine, it would be impossible to go back any further than to the point where the machine was first used. This means that Ronald's dream of going back in time to save his father, or at least say goodbye, isn't a possibility, even if the machine could be created. Despite that realization, Ronald has continued to work on theories and share his passion for research into time travel technology and possibilities. Number 3. Wormholes are one of the most common ways that people, including scientists, suggest time travel might be possible. But so far, few scientists believe that using these theoretical bodies to create a time machine is anywhere close to reality. Engineer Marshall Barnes is one of the few that does believe. Wormholes are only theoretically possible at the moment. No scientist has been able to prove one exists, but using Einstein's two theories of relativity and quantum mechanics, it's possible to prove that they could exist in theory. Put simply, a wormhole would connect one area of space-time to another. They've been described as shortcuts through the universe, connecting two faraway places through a narrow, shorter tunnel. But as space and time are connected, wormholes could also transport people through time. Using naturally occurring wormholes would not guarantee that travelers get where they want to, but another solution has been suggested. If two connected wormholes were created on Earth, and one was transported at close to the speed of light, that wormhole would experience time slower than its counterpart on Earth. So someone could use these wormholes to travel between the two times. Research into wormholes is a fascinating study for scientists interested in how the universe works. Often, scientists are trying to prove how wormholes cannot exist, as the concept seems to break the known laws of physics. However, nobody has been able to prove these science fiction-sounding portals don't exist. Our understanding of physics is always evolving. Einstein's theories broke previously accepted laws of physics, so it's possible some new revolutionary discovery could take place and change everything. Some scientists even believe wormholes are the answer to how the universe was created. At the moment, the Big Bang Theory is the most widely accepted explanation for the creation of the universe, but that still means that everything was created from nothing. This theory suggests that the universe actually looped back on itself, with the matter at the beginning of creation coming from later in the universe through a wormhole. This isn't a widely accepted theory, though. One thing that most scientists do agree on is that creating wormholes doesn't seem to be a possibility. Scientists believe it would take an exotic substance such as negative matter to create a wormhole and to keep it open long enough for something to be transported through. It's also incredibly unlikely that these wormholes would be big enough to send anything bigger than particles through. Marshall Barnes believes that he's on the road to creating a traversable wormhole, though. Marshall is a research and design engineer who has multiple papers on time travel, wormholes, and parallel universes. He also believes he's created a device that can harness microscopic wormholes. The device is called the Verdrioung fan. The device is a metal fan connected to a box that Marshall calls a space-time dilator transport system. The box itself doesn't power the fan, but it's connected to the metal surrounding the fan. That then creates a special electromagnetic field that twists and distorts the space in front of the fan. This, he claims, creates wormholes. To prove his device, Marshall appeared on a radio show, which was also streamed on YouTube. He placed the Verdrioung fan in front of an old TV that uses an infrared remote control. When the device is turned on, the remote control doesn't work when placed behind the fan. Marshall claims that the fan itself isn't blocking the light, but it instead falls into one of the micro wormholes that he's created. Like other proposed time travel devices, the Verdrioung fan would need a lot more power to be able to generate a wormhole large enough for a human to traverse through. But it wouldn't need negative matter or anything more complicated than electromagnetic fields. Marshall has not yet revealed how he would be able to control when and where the wormhole would transport people. He does believe that the time travel wouldn't be limited to when the wormhole was first opened up, though, and we could theoretically go as far back in time as we wanted to. Marshall also claims to have proven that parallel universes exist. For many time travel experts, parallel universes would be necessary for time travel to happen without paradoxes. The most famous time travel paradox is the grandfather paradox. In it, a time traveler goes back in time to stop his grandparents from meeting. They never have children and he's never born. But if he's never born, he can't go back in time to stop his grandparents from meeting. Scientists believe that paradoxes like this would make time travel impossible. There would be some law of physics prohibiting it from happening, even if we haven't discovered what it is. But parallel universes would mean we don't need to worry about paradoxes. When someone travels back in time, they travel back in time to another universe. That way, if they were to stop their grandparents from meeting, then it wouldn't have any impact on their existence. Their grandparents in their universe would still have met. Marshall claims to have successfully completed an experiment first proposed by German astrophysicist Rainer Plage in 1995. The experiment used a laser and ions in a magnetic trap to detect laser lights coming from a parallel universe. Marshall saw exactly what Plage predicted would be seen if parallel universes existed, and so has proven that these universes do exist. Unlike some other scientists who are trying to develop time travel technology, Marshall is very secretive about his work. He claims that he doesn't want others to profit from his work, but his secrecy may be more than that. He believes his research has a national security aspect to it. Marshall claims he's been tested and passed, which has allowed him to continue working on his projects. He says he would love to go into more detail about what he's doing and how it works, but he believes that this could lead to his work being used against the United States. The secrecy has led to some criticism from other scientists. Normally, a discovery isn't accepted as fact unless an experiment can be successfully conducted by other scientists. Without any insights into Marshall's work, so far nobody has been able to do that. But if Marshall's time machine does work, it may simply be a matter of funding before time travel is a possibility. Number 2. Many time travel stories and mysteries don't involve people intentionally traveling back in time. The most frequent of these stories are about people who accidentally slipped back. The most famous of these was the Moberly Jourdain incident. The time travel story centers on two English academics who spent an afternoon in the 1700s while wandering through the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. Years later, they published their story under pseudonyms, knowing that it would ruin their reputations if it got out that they were the ones suggesting that they had this paranormal experience. The women in question were Charlotte Ann Elizabeth Moberly and Eleanor Frances Jourdain. Charlotte would have been in her mid-50s at the time of the incident in 1901, and Eleanor was in her 30s. Both women came from well-to-do families and were well-educated. Charlotte was the daughter of the headmaster of Winchester College and Bishop of Salisbury. Her traveling companion was the daughter of the vicar of Ashburn. But the women were successful in their own right. Charlotte had been hired as the first principal of St. Hugh's College at Oxford University, and in 1901 she was looking for a deputy. Eleanor had applied for the role. The trip to France in August was in part so that they could get to know one another. The two women first visited the palace. This had been the home of the French royal court in the 1600s, up until the French Revolution. It was here where Queen Marie Antoinette had some of her last happy moments. The women found the palace itself dull and decided to try to make their way to the Petit Trianon, a smaller chateau. During the reign of King Louis XVI, it was given to his wife and became her sanctuary, where none of her inner circle were permitted. She redesigned the gardens and enjoyed the escape from the royal court. Charlotte and Eleanor were using a guidebook to try to get to the Petit Trianon. It was their first time at the palace, and they weren't completely sure where to go. At one point, they missed the wide drive that would have led them to the chateau and walked down a narrow lane instead. At this point, things began to get strange. Both women experienced a strange feeling of anxiety and melancholy, as if something was very wrong. At one point, they passed a house where Charlotte saw a woman waving a white cloth from a window. Eleanor didn't see the woman, but did see some old farm buildings. They continued to walk, feeling more and more as if they were somewhere that they shouldn't be. They were certain that they were lost, especially when they came to a point where the path branched off into three. They continued on through and came across two men in strange clothing. They wore long green coats and three-cornered hats. For some reason, the women assumed that they were gardening staff, despite their strange attire. They asked for directions and found the men to be polite but cold as they pointed the women further down the path. As they went on, things began to feel unreal. The women passed another cottage with a woman and teenage girl outside. They looked like waxworks. Even the trees seemed strange. They described them as being like wood worked in a tapestry, with no effects of shade or light. There was also no wind. It was as they walked through this wooded area that they came across another strange individual. A man sat near a garden kiosk. He gave the women a bad feeling, even worse than they had experienced so far. His expression was described as evil yet unseeing, and the women felt what they described as repugnance going past him. At this point, they were approached by another man who rushed up and guided them away from the strange individual. He gave them directions to the chateau, and they finally escaped the strange wooded area. But the time slip continued. Now they had reached the area that had once been the private sanctuary of the Queen, and it seemed to still be that way, more than 100 years after the monarchy had fallen. At one point, they went to the chapel, only for a man to leave the building and warn them not to approach the Queen's private entrance. Charlotte and Eleanor left the building to head to the main Petit Trianon. Sitting in a low seat in the grass, Charlotte saw a woman sketching. She was wearing a white hat, a green top, and a light-colored skirt. Charlotte and Eleanor passed close to the sketching woman, and Eleanor remembered a feeling of needing to move her skirt out of the way to make way for someone. This was despite the fact that she never recalled seeing the sketching woman. After the long detours, Charlotte and Eleanor made their way to the Petit Trianon. Immediately, the strange feeling lifted. They were surrounded by tourists from 1901 and a wedding party that was celebrated at the tourist attraction. This was no longer the Queen's private home. It would be a few days before the women spoke about what they had experienced. One asked the other if they believed the Petit Trianon was haunted. The other responded definitely. At first, they believed they may have seen ghosts, but they weren't sure. Over the next few years, they researched the history of the palace, matching their experiences to people who had been there in the past. They also revisited the palace numerous times. In 1902, Charlotte returned alone and again found herself in the woods. She heard music in the distance, despite the fact that no bands were permitted to play on the palace grounds in the winter. In later visits, they found that they couldn't take the paths they had taken during the time slip. They simply didn't exist anymore. A bridge that they had walked over was no longer there. Buildings that had been in good condition were now in ruins. They went to the chapel where they had been warned away from on their first visit. The door wouldn't budge, and a staff member informed them that it hadn't been opened in living memory. It may not have been opened since the royal family had lived in the palace. Charlotte believed that the woman she saw sketching was Marie Antoinette herself, but it was only after seeing one particular painting that she came to that conclusion. It was a painting of the Queen by Adolf Wertmüller. One of Marie Antoinette's companions, Madame Campan, claimed that it was the only portrait that accurately portrayed her likeness, and it was the portrait that reminded Charlotte of the woman sketching in the grass. In 1911, the women published a book that told the story of their experiences. They used pseudonyms, not wanting anybody to ridicule them for believing that they'd experienced something paranormal. It proved to be controversial, with many people believing the women and others believing it was a fantasy. One explanation came from a biography of Robert de Montesquieu. Montesquieu lived near the palace in 1901 and would often have parties that required his guests to dress up in period fashion. Some believe that was what Charlotte and Eleanor saw, though it wouldn't explain the strange layout of the gardens or the strange feelings both felt as they walked through the time slip. Others believe the two women made it all up. Charlotte in particular had many paranormal experiences, and once claimed to have seen an apparition of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the Louvre. While they may have originally published the book under pseudonyms, it may simply have been two women who liked to tell stories that could not be explained. Number 1. In the mid-1990s, a 21-year-old student made headlines after he was arrested for stealing equipment to build a time machine. The man was Mike Markham, and some years after he first found fame, he claimed to actually have traveled through time. Mike Markham was a young man living in Stanbury, Missouri, when his experiments with time travel began. They would end with him lying in a field miles away from his makeshift laboratory, and with no memory of the past 2 years. He had previously lived in Ohio and spent 2 years on an electrical training course at Rio Grande College before moving to Missouri. It was 1993 and there wasn't much to do in the area besides fishing and building models. Mike, who had always been bright compared to his peers, spent his free time building electrical equipment. In December of 1993, he built a Jacob's ladder. Jacob's ladder is a very basic experiment, the sort of thing a science teacher might use to try to get the students interested in electricity. 2 metal rods are attached to a transformer, with instructions often recommending a typical neon sign transformer. The rods stretch upwards and are positioned to gradually get further away the higher they are. When the transformer is turned on, electrons jump from one rod to another, creating an arc of light that climbs up between the 2 rods as heat rises. This was all Mike was expecting when he set up the experiment on his kitchen table. But something else was created along with the arcs of electricity. Hovering just above the ladder was a ball of heat that created what looked like a vortex. Mike couldn't explain what he was looking at, but decided to experiment. He tossed a small sheet metal screw into the vortex to see what would happen. For a second, it disappeared. Moments later, it reappeared sitting on the table beside the transformer. Time travel wasn't the first thing that came to mind. At first, he thought this might have been some phenomenon relating to light bending, which could effectively turn something invisible, but the sheet screw had appeared silently on the table. There was no sound of it dropping or rolling away from where Mike had tossed it. He then began to think of other explanations for what he had seen. Time travel was one solution he couldn't rule out. He guessed that the screw had been transported in a few seconds into the future, and it had reappeared when time caught up with it. He threw a few more screws into the vortex, wanting to make sure he wasn't just hallucinating what he was seeing. Before he could borrow a camcorder to record his experiments, the ladder caught fire. According to Mike, it shouldn't have been running for so long at such a high voltage. He was able to put the fire out, but the equipment was destroyed. The ball of heat and vortex was like nothing Mike had ever seen before. He wasn't a professional scientist, but did read about electronics, and he was pretty sure nobody else had seen anything like this either. Mike kept his experience to himself for a while. He wanted to continue to test, but he also wanted to work on something bigger. If a vortex the size of a dime was big enough for a screw, he believed he needed to create a device 100 times bigger for something as big as a human to travel through. The problem with this plan was that Mike didn't have a lot of money. He would need several transformers to get the power he needed for this time machine, and that would be thousands of dollars. In early 1995, Mike found the transformers he needed. They belonged to the St. Joseph Light and Power Generating Station in King City and were sitting unused near a substation. According to reports at the time, they were stored behind a padlocked fence, but Mike disputed this. The 6 transformers weighed 250 to 350 pounds and cost an estimated $300,000 each. Mike quickly got to work creating his second time machine, while authorities tried to locate the missing generators. In late January, he turned it on for the first time. He was hooked up directly to the electricity grid, and with that much power being used for the machine, the power in the surrounding areas began to dim. His neighbors called in the power outages, but it didn't take long for authorities to piece the 2 incidents together. When Mike was arrested, he opened up about his ambitions. He told them he was creating a time machine, and he was only borrowing the generators. He didn't expect anybody to believe his story, but the Associated Press heard the story, and it was soon making headlines around the country. People were amazed to discover he was genuinely serious about his ambitions. He had notebooks filled with schematics for his time machine, and he never changed his story about the teleporting or time-traveling screw. He spent 2 months in prison and was on probation for 5 years, but the publicity surrounding his arrest may have made the punishment worthwhile. Many people thought he was crazy, but many others wanted to help his dream of becoming the first person to invent a time machine. After his release, he was invited to talk on TV shows and gave interviews for the written press. It was with Art Bell's Coast to Coast radio show that he got the most attention, though. Coast to Coast covered numerous paranormal and unexplained events over the years, and his listeners were the perfect audience for Mike. He appeared on the show twice, once in 1995 and once in 97. During his first appearance, he received donations both in the form of money and in the form of equipment. It was more than he could have hoped for, and he got to work building another time machine. He had moved to Kansas City by this point, and was gifted space in a warehouse to conduct his experiments. Over the next 2 years, he built the time machine and ran experiments on guinea pigs. According to Mike, the guinea pigs would be thrown into the east or west side of the warehouse, leaving Mike to speculate that his time machine interacted with the Earth's magnetic field in some way. In 1997, he told listeners of the show that he would be ready to test the machine itself in 30 days, and gave an address for them to go and watch. But shortly after that interview, he vanished. What followed was roughly 20 years of speculation. Some listeners believed that he had been successful in traveling back in time, but had gotten trapped there. One listener contacted Art Bell with the story about a body found on a beach in the 1930s. It had been stuffed in a metal tube and had with it a device that looked like a modern cell phone. Mike had said the only thing that he would take with him was his cell phone. Others believed that Madman Markham, as Art Bell called him, had just been a fraud or had gone to live in obscurity. There were reports of him living homeless in various areas, including Hawaii. In 2011, a reporter for Nexus magazine claimed to have tracked down and interviewed Mike. According to the interview, Mike's time machine hadn't been operational until 1998, but he had gone ahead with the experiment. He jumped into the Vortex and disappeared. He woke up in a field in Fairfield, Ohio, some 600 miles from the warehouse where his time machine was built, and it was the year 2000. At first, Mike didn't have any memory of what happened to him, but slowly those began to come back. Apparently, no missing person report had been filed, despite the fact that he was still under probation when he disappeared. He went back to the warehouse where the time machine had been left and found it empty. All of his notebooks had also vanished without a trace. In 2015, a man claiming to be Mike Markham appeared on Art Bell's new show, Midnight in the Desert. It's hard to know if this was the same person who had appeared on the show before. Many listeners were unimpressed with this 41-year-old Mike Markham, but he had the same story as the Nexus article and explained that he'd been homeless for some time. He also said he wanted to build another time machine but was currently working odd jobs and didn't have the money to fund another experiment. Scientists don't believe Mike Markham had actually created a time machine. His machine doesn't fit into any known theories of time travel, with gravity playing a much larger role in time travel theories than electricity. But with Mike's time machine having apparently disappeared, we can't be certain he didn't create something that we don't understand. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.